So I want to introduce myself in a little bit longer way than I normally would, but it really has to do with the engaged learning part of what Scott mentioned. And so when I was in high school, and in fact I could probably make a case that even when I was in junior high, I was engaged in experiential learning. And I've always believed in it. When I went to the University of California, Davis to do my undergraduate work, I had the opportunity to be engaged then. And we got involved with some farm workers who had been displaced, understandably, by mechanization that the university had developed. So in the tomato fields, there had been strikes in the years before I got there. And the mechanization created the opportunity for, if there had been 100 workers picking a field the year before, in the first year, after the mechanization was introduced, you could get that down to 3 workers could do the work that 100 had done. And in the next year, an electric eye was introduced. And that brought it down to 2 workers who could pick what 100 used to pick. Well, my experiential learning when I was an undergraduate was that we started 2 worker-owned farms for 400 people at each of those different operations, and I learned an awful lot about how to market specialty crops. I didn't learn enough about business to know that when I went to graduate school, I went and got a PhD rather than an MBA, but it worked out. I think what I'll do is move through these slides fairly quickly, leave some time for you for questions, and I know that I'm preaching to the converted here, so if I seem like a little bit of an advocate, it's not that I'm trying to convince you, I'm really trying to give you ideas on how you might be able to convince others. And I want you to understand that my perspective is one of an economist, and I apologize for that. So what's the macro context? We're trying to create good paying jobs, that's the key issue. A basic belief that I have is that wages across developing nations will probably stay fairly stagnant. We could debate that, but if it's true that equalization will continue, then the US and a few other markets probably are not going to go up as much. And that creates some real issues around the poverty side. The implications of all this are that you'll have low growth economies in the developing world. And so this is the flow of my presentation. Each time I get to a new section, you'll see that the blue part is where I'm going. So I'll talk a little bit about inequality, about how good jobs will continue to flow overseas, probably for a long time, how traditional education has to be part of an answer to inequality, how the MOOCs and MOOC-like structures will challenge traditional education, how really in the end engaged learning is part of the answer, and that if you can have progressive businesses be part of that engaged learning, it's even better. And so why use the lens of wealth? Well, it really comes down to lots of people do so because money matters. And if you really think about it seriously, it's probably the preferred way to look at the world. I would argue that most of you probably approach the world from a somewhat economically determined perspective. I have to admit to a preference toward greater income equality, greater opportunity. I'd rather just tell you that's my bias. And if you asked why I feel that way, I really can't say. I think I was just born this way. And the final thing I'll say about this is that if we thought about this from a species perspective, if you study elephants, elephants actually know how to take care of those members of their species who've passed away. There are sensitivities in a whole variety of species. And I would argue for us, if we assume that we're the superior species, I think we have an obligation to try to take care of the poor to a greater degree than we probably do right now. And so if we're going to talk about wealth, I think it's really important to know what wealth is. And so this is basically a graph that shows wealth in the world. My estimate, it's somewhere around $240 trillion. It's interesting to put that in the context of the whole US government budget, $3.5 trillion. The money's not with government. The money is with people who have invested in stock, who've invested in bonds, who own land. That's where the money is. And so if we're going to change education, if we're going to alleviate poverty, I think we have to do it through business. I noticed that Scott told me that someone from the Chamber of Commerce had walked in. I think those are the types of institutions. I see Bill here from the United Way who works with businesses in ongoing ways. It's that connection between business and society that we have to figure out ways to make work, to really, I think, make progress. In the end, what I want to honor are the job creators. They're the ones who will help us alleviate poverty over time. So this is just some information that shows what's happened with wealth in the U.S. Essentially, over time, you've seen that the gray at the top is the 1%, the bottom in the red is the 99%, and so essentially you've seen people in my economic class take on more of the total wealth. I'm not going to complain about that, but I think it's important just to recognize that's where we are. And then if you ask what's happened from an age perspective, the blue line at the top is the United States, and this shows what percent of, well, it's essentially debts over assets by age. And so what you see is in the 25 to 34 category on the far left, that of all the nations listed there, that the U.S. has the highest debt for its young people. Those of you who are in higher education are very aware of this. If you go back to a species type of approach, I would argue that if you are a species that doesn't take care of your young around keeping them out of debt, it's probably not good for the society long term. This shows wealth per adult, shows the dip after the 2008 recession, but still pretty healthy total wealth per adult at around $250,000 per adult. And here's where the composition of the wealth is. It's mostly financial. Real includes not just real estate, but other types of holdings that are not purely financial. And you see the debts are going to take away from the total wealth to get that net worth that we just talked about. And then if you compare to the rest of the world, no surprise here, we're wealthier. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I think if I had asked all of you, you would have said exactly what I said. And so what about wealth and income distribution? There's a way to measure that. It's called the Gini coefficient, and essentially it gives numbers from 0 to 100. And the 0 value would be if everybody was identical in income, and 100 would be where one person had everything. And so here's what's happened with the Gini coefficient in the US, 1980 to 2010. And you see essentially that same type of inequality simply increasing as time has gone by. If you then compare us to other nations, we're right there on the left side next to Nigeria. Probably not a great place to be, but not as bad as South Africa. And this could be perceived as a little bit propagandistic. By the time I get to the end, though, I think you'll find that I'm fairly reasonable about some of these issues. So you've got 1% of the world's wealthiest have got 40% of all financial assets, land, building, and other tangible property. In contrast, the bottom half own 1%. The richest fifth consume 86% of all goods and services. And the three richest people have assets that exceed the combined gross domestic product of 48 least developed countries. And then finally, the world's richest 225 individuals have a combined wealth of $1 trillion, and that would be equal to the annual income of the poorest 47% of the entire world's population. But the part where I think if you were kind of concerned about people talking about the 1%, I think in some ways the most important fact is if you took all of the wealth away from those 225 individuals, gave it to that bottom group, essentially you would have simply doubled the income for people for 1 year, and then the people at the very top wouldn't have anything. And I think what this really argues is there's not as much wealth as you'd think to help really change things at the very top. So we've got to take a new approach, and that's where business comes in and changing the way business runs. But you can't change business unless you have an approach that changes the educational system to make not only the education system meet the needs of the business community to a greater degree, but it also, the educational system needs to feed the business system so the business system can actually meet the needs of people in the society. And so this is when I switched to a very short section just on how good jobs will continue to flow overseas for a long time. No real surprise in the top, so decades of growth around 10% in China. But this next statistic is really one of the most meaningful statistics, I think, in the whole world. Never has there been a time when so many people have come out of poverty so quickly. So 600 million people coming out of poverty in China in the years from 1981 to 2004. Think about the size of that number, and then look at that final bullet point. And so this is measured where people went from $1.25 a day, where 85% of people were at that level or below in 1981, to where it's only 27% on an inflation-adjusted basis 13 years later. Never in the history of the world have so many people come out of poverty so quickly, and it's pretty clear that's because of business. Now, there have been some environmental consequences, but if you ask the question, what happened to the jobs that were here that aren't here anymore, a lot of them went to China. And that type of thing is going to continue to happen as jobs flow to Africa, to other places where the incomes are even lower. And so I think we have to be prepared for that, and I think we have to initiate policies throughout our education system and through our business communities that will make a difference. Now this section's even smaller from a number of words perspective, so I call this Assume the Can Opener story. And so as an economist, I get to tell my one dumb joke. You don't have to laugh just to make me feel better. It really is a dumb joke. So you take three scientists. I'm going to assume for the moment that an economist is a scientist. One of them's a chemist, the other one's a physicist, and the last one's the dumb economist. And they're on an island stranded, and they have a can of beans that's going to save them at least until the ship gets there. And the chemist decides he's going to pour some chemical on his can of beans, and of course he ruins the beans, so that doesn't work. And so the physicist sets up this Rube Goldberg system, and the hammer comes down, crashes the beans into the sand, and they lose that can. And so the economist turns to them and says, assume a can opener. And so what I'm going to tell you right now is, what I want you to do is simply assume that traditional education, in fact, will continue to be part of the answer to inequality. I don't think there's much doubt that if you look back over time that assuming the can opener here would be that there has been a history of education helping make people more equal. Does anybody disagree with that? Because we could argue it, but I'd rather not have to prove it. Anybody disagree that education has been an equalizer? Okay, so we can assume the can opener. And so the fourth point, I think what I really want to do is to give you evidence that you have to move toward engaged education because you have a huge threat right at your doorstep with these MOOCs. And I'll tell you what MOOCs are right now. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. I'm not sure people know, A, what the context always is for the development of the MOOCs, or what they're really doing. But I find this statistic just to be shocking. We know that education has gotten more expensive. Everybody knows that. But with the 559% increase in cost in the US over the last 10 years for education, that's double the rate of the increase in medical costs. That's a dramatic difference. We complain a lot about medical costs going up, but education's been double the rate. And if you look at 50% of recent graduates not working in the field that they were trained for, that's a real issue. And I was at breakfast yesterday, and people were talking about individuals they know. We all know people who had their hearts and minds set on a certain career, and they haven't been able to get jobs for what they were trained for. I think that's another really strong argument that we've got to make some changes in education. And so this massive threat that the MOOCs have presented us with leads me to this introductory statement. And it's going to sound a little bit apologetic, but I'm going to go ahead anyway. So I know I risk losing some of you as I present on the massive open online courses, MOOCs. My approach will sound like an advocate, and I'm just going to admit I am an advocate for MOOCs. It can be dangerous to present on these topics in certain public education environments. I told Scott no one could bring tomatoes today, and I hope you haven't, although I did notice some cherry ones there. But so remember, I'm using the MOOC as a description of a threat to traditional public education. So I'm really trying to give you evidence and ways that you can make yourself stronger. And so you can use MOOCs as a reason to advocate for more engaged education. And I think the real question is experiential education something that we should use just to fight against MOOCs? Or is it really that MOOCs plus experiential education or engaged learning is the best combination? And I actually would choose the latter. And so try to figure out ways that online and experience can generate the type of growth for your students that will really help the economy and the world. And so here are 3 of the MOOCs at the very top, and then there's some MOOC-like institutions that I'm not going to talk about at all, the bottom 3. And I'm just going to choose one of the biggest of the MOOCs, Coursera. I met the CEO of Coursera about a month ago as she was coming through Oxford after leaving the big conference in Davos. And she is one of the most amazing women I've ever met in my life. And so they're looking at 2.8 million students having registered now with Coursera, and 1.4 million enrollments in classes each month at the current rate. Contemplate that. How many UVUs is that are being created, essentially, if you were to just accept for the moment that there are some comparables between big public institutions and the MOOCs? People have a visual image of how big this really is? Now, it's not as big as you think when we get to the last slide, but it's still very big. 62 universities, including that list of great ones, have joined just in this one of the MOOCs. And what does it mean? Well, classes are free. You may pay for your certificate later on, but little as $50. Many of the world's best professors, you've got a situation where they're really focused on mastery. And when you see some of the outcomes, I think the mastery is actually working. Over 8 million tests taken, and the basis of each class is as simple as an 8 to 12 minute video. I think an understanding of the lack of attention span is something that probably is built into this model. And then the students are meeting all around the world. So much of the education is based on a repeat and retrieve pedagogy, where the students can't move on until they've mastered certain concepts. And then if they miss a test question, they can then get back a personalized message. If you have 100,000 students in a class and 2,000 people all miss the same question, there's plenty of economic value in going to create particular advice you can give students so they won't make that mistake again. And so there is the ability almost to individualize, although for very large numbers of individuals, so that people can learn and not make the same mistakes again. And then the grading can be done very effectively, both on a computerized basis, but then you've got this peer grading as well. And it turns out that studies show that the peers grade the same way the faculty does. And then you get the added benefit of the students actually learning more as they grade, so it reinforces what they've learned. Now, when they post something on a computer saying, "I don't understand," the average time now for a student to get an answer back from one of his or her peers is just 22 minutes. And that's all hours of the day, because these MOOCs are international. People are in any part of the world apt to be studying anytime. And then these study groups are formed, so in Starbucks around the world, the students can be meeting up to study together. Some of the things that are most fascinating to me have to do with the ability to do research on student outcomes. So this is just one example that was cited by the CEO when she was in Oxford the other day. They wanted to know what's the best way to encourage students to not procrastinate. And if you look at their graphs of when students actually take the quizzes, there are huge spikes right before the deadlines. And of course, that's not always the best way to learn. So they wanted to try to change people's behavior. They sent out 3 different types of email. One that was a threat, and then they sent one that had the same type of thermometer that you might see when we're doing a fundraising campaign for a school district. And the red goes up as more money is raised. Well, the red went up in this thermometer as the students accomplished more and took more quizzes. And then combined with that message was just a mild warning, you're a little bit late here. And then the last method was an email that went out just with encouraging words. Well, it's fascinating to have the knowledge now that number 2 works dramatically better. And when you're dealing with 2.8 million students, you have the ability to test what kinds of messages work best. And then you can break it down by nationality, by age, And it's just incredible what's available. And this is where the threat to traditional education comes in. And so last month, the American Council on Education approved 5 of Coursera's courses for credit equivalency. I mean, there had been movements in places like Minnesota to essentially ban Coursera, but it looks like that Coursera is going to be able to move forward along with other corporations that will actually sell the certificates that the students can gain when they finish their courses. This is a huge threat, and part of it is that a huge threat to traditional education, and part of it is that employers are taking this very seriously. So if universities don't change, the employers are going to say, we like Coursera more than they like us, and that's a problem for us. There are some potential drawbacks to MOOCs. I think you'll find these statistics absolutely fascinating. So this is a set of statistics about drop-off of student participation. So in a course at Duke in the fall of 2012, you found that in this bioelectricity class that 12,725 students enrolled. More than 7,000 watched a video, but only 3,600 attempted a quiz. And then only 345 actually took the final exam, and only 313 passed. You've got time to make the changes because this isn't working as well as they want it to. But you don't have a lot of time. You don't have a lot of time. So we move to why engaged learning is part of the answer. And I'm going to acknowledge here that I'm including a lot of different topics all at once. And I'm going to give you some very particular examples, but not before I give you some introductory comments on this particular part of my presentation. So you'd accept that students care about jobs and that there are many different types of good jobs. And I'm going to talk just about 2 types. One in what I'll call impact investing jobs, and I'll define impact investing for you in a moment. And then jobs at companies where the companies actually have an impact in making the world a better place. And there are many other types of job-oriented, engaged education opportunities. And then it's important to recognize as well that there's some types of great engaged learning that don't have any focus on jobs at all. And I'm here to applaud those of you who are working on those types of themes as well. But my focus is jobs and working through business. And so here's one example from Oxford, where I run the Said Business School Venture Fund. And essentially what we've done has been to create a £1 million fund. That's $1.5 million, not very big, but bigger than some. And what we do is invest in Oxford-related companies. Oxford-related means that at the very least there needs to be somebody on the board of advisors who has an affiliation with Oxford, maybe as an alum. And we're affiliated with what's called the Entrepreneurship Center at Oxford. This is my definition of impact investing. And so essentially, if you go left to right here, you're providing capital to a business designed with an intent to make a positive impact. We're not counting not intentional impacts. You've got to have an intent to make the world a better place. Remember I said before, anybody who goes out and tries to create a job for somebody, if they do that intentionally, they're my heroes. So that's impact investing when we fund somebody to help do that. We generate positive social and environmental impact, and we measure it. You've got to measure if you're going to make any changes. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And then we also expect a financial return. I'm a capitalist. I believe in returns. Sometimes we accept a little bit less if it can have a larger social impact. So our hope is that we'll continue to get support from our alums. I'll just tell you a quick story of how the original money was raised. In a room a little bit bigger than this, 2 billionaires were talking at Oxford and said to the students, you've got to go out and get some experience if you ever expect to be as successful as we are. And one of the students stood up at the back of the room and said, well, that's really easy for you to say. Why don't you help us get some experience? And one of the billionaires looked at the other and said, I'm in for $500,000 if you are. And the other guy said, me too. And that's how our fund was established. And honestly, that's the type of effort that I think we need to see more people make. I'll tell you about somebody who's done that here in Utah in a few minutes. I know some of you know about Jim Sorensen's work. And so our goals are to make great investments. We want to manage our portfolio companies well, and we want to exit and reap the returns, and then recycle the funds back through our Said Business School Venture Fund. We're not paying for the money we get. It's all come in donations. And so what do? We're, first of all, worrying that the FSA, which is similar to the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission here, won't put us out of business. So I always put a little clause in here that says I'm aware that I could get in trouble if anybody thought that I was asking for money. I'm not asking for money today. Up to $1 million investments is what we plan to do per company in the future. So we're out trying to raise more donations, and we believe if we make larger donations, we'll actually make better investments. And we'll do it with what are called syndicates or club deals. This is financial services language where we'd be working with other private equity groups, other investment companies, and our students would work side by side with people who actually knew what they were doing. And this is one of the problems that often happens with university projects, is we send students out and they try to do stuff they don't know how to do. And we all make this argument, learn by mistakes. Well, if all you do is make mistakes, you don't learn from that. And so you've got to figure out a way to make mistakes and be there with people who know what they're doing. And we think that if we do that, that our students will actually be more successful in their job searches as well. So you remember, I started with jobs, I'm back to jobs. If you can have students working with people who create jobs, they will get jobs. That's a good thing. And students manage the deals, and they develop the transferable portfolio management skills that are really important. So not everybody that works with us is going to be making investments as professionals. They're going to be working for companies as well, and we want them to learn how to add value to companies while they're doing this, because that's what you need to do if you're going to help be a successful business person. These are the countries where we're working right now. Just closed a deal in Rwanda the other day. And these are 7 of the 9 companies that, that were invested in. The other 2 were both too small at the time we made this slide to have logos. But as we move up the food chain, everybody will have a logo. So what do? I won't talk about all of them, but Signify is a company that is working to figure out what it is about patterns of people's cell phone bills when they're poor in Mexico or Brazil to make them good credit risks. And there are algorithms, mathematical formulas that they've discovered that you can actually use to give money, information to banks that want to make money available, either through credit cards or loans, microfinance. And so Signify is a significant intermediary providing important information about the poor to others so that the poor can actually receive services. Know-How Mart is a company that's in the market for essentially putting people with knowledge together with those who need that knowledge. So it's a broker that pulls consultants, lawyers, and others together with those who need services. And the MBO school is one where we're helping managers and employees assist firms in having their employees buy their companies. But all this work isn't done without there being some unintended consequences. And these are just 3 of them. And so I've been looking at this for a while. I know we had some transactions done before I got there that students did to pad their resumes. And so there are ethical challenges associated with this. Another problem is if you invest in student companies and the companies don't go well, you may be saddling some of your best students with, in one of the cases, debt that student took on with his relatives, his brothers and sisters, and his parents, in what was a bad company. Nobody ever should have made that particular investment. And then I think this last point is really important. Right now, you have a relationship with your alums where they give you money. If you switch this over and all of a sudden you're giving your alums money, that changes the relationship. And you shouldn't do that without being really aware of how you're doing it. Because if your medium wealthy alums expect you to be funding their companies, they're probably not going to be giving you money at the same time. It's a real issue. And this may seem a little bit odd, but I want to leave a next step slide with you, partly just to give you an idea that we're not fully baked yet. So we're trying to receive the endorsement of our benefactors, the same guys who both put in the 500 million pounds, the 500,000 pounds before, to make some changes to the fund. And we're trying to solicit advice regarding whether or not they will both make more donations themselves, but also help us raise money from their friends. And until we can get a larger sum of money, I don't think we're going to be as effective as we want to be. And then the final slide I'll show you from this part of the presentation before I switch over to something from the University of Utah for just a couple of minutes. We'll talk about the synergies where we're tying this program back into the business school. Because up till now, it could be running separately. But I think what I'm trying to tell you is a lot of things need to be integrated. Education needs to be more integrated with business. Well, things like the Said Business School Venture Fund need to be more integrated within the business school. And so some of the things we've done here is we've been able to get our membership, which is 92 of the 195 students in the whole school. So half of the students are participating with me in this program. And they have a special computerized platform where they do some of their learning. And they have to do entrepreneurial projects as part of that platform. And so we're saying, use the companies within our portfolio to do some of your experiments, to do some of your consulting. We're also having them write business plans for the entrepreneurial ventures that we're invested in. So again, trying to integrate right across the board. And since we've chosen demographics and aging populations as the major topic for our online platform this year, a lot of the students are focused on trying to help around those issues. So I'm going to read word for word, not all the words on these 9 slides, but just a few, and you can read along with me. And the goal is to accelerate and advance the understanding and application of principles of free enterprise to create scalable and sustainable global societal change. And so I just made an argument about something that was happening in Oxford. And I think that when it really comes down to it, the key question is, can it work in Utah? And the answer is, it already is. And so you had a $13 million gift come in at the beginning of this year to support students with real-life experience and interaction with industry leaders in the impact investing space, creating jobs. On the venture fund side, which is what I started with at Oxford, they've graduated over 250 students, 24 investments, 8 exits. That means they sold the companies they invested in. 2 of them were through IPOs, initial public offerings, and they've made 6 acquisitions. They've got professional work products, they've got a multi-stage training program, and they've got alumni in top business situations. That's a meaningful track record right there. Now, they've been able to train top students. They've been able to collaborate with leading social venture funds. They've been able to facilitate the growth of emerging industry. Impact investing, some people say, is a $500 billion market. There's some people who argue that it's worth more than $1 trillion over the next 10 years. First bullet point, provide comprehensive early stage advisory services. Part of the $13 million is going into a curriculum to help support impact investing around the world. And so they're trying to replicate the good track record that they've created. It's tied to research. They've got student internships. They've got a global impact investment competition started. This is probably the single most important institution in any university now working on impact investing, and it's here in your state. The bottom part of this shows what students do as they move through it. So they start as interns, they move over to become associates, and then they become senior associates, and all these things can happen in the first case in the first semester, in the second case in the second and third, and then in the last, it would be from the 4th semester on. And these are 2 students who have participated. It's interesting, the guy on the right didn't want to just participate for 4 semesters. He wanted to do it the whole time that he was in college. The guy on the left was involved in a project in Bali, in Indonesia. And it's interesting to see one of his plans for the future is to go back to the country he was born in and become the president of Gabon. That's the type of chutzpah that a lot of the students that I work with have. These are 4 of the investments that they've participated in. It's interesting to see the impact here. So, and the first one on the left, this is a small and medium-sized enterprise lending company in India, creating new jobs. The second one is working in the access to energy field. The third one, creating affordable homes, and the last one, a factory that is creating fair jobs at fair wages. I wanted to end with just one quick story and then the words of my mom. So I was not arguing, I was just stating an opinion as we were getting ready for this. The gentleman from BYU came up. And I was saying, you know, there's not much difference between engaged learning in a university and engaged learning in the workplace. We call it participatory management in the workplace. And so I want to tell you the quick story of a man named Luis. When we were looking at helping the employees buy a major part of Union Carbide after Bhopal. Some of you will remember that disaster in India. And so Union Carbide was under some real pressure and had to sell off units. And this plant in Houston, Texas, on a warm summer day, probably 100 degrees and close to 100% humidity inside the warehouse where we met with all the workers. We'd spent 3 hours coming to the understanding of what kind of sacrifices the employees would need to make before they could become participative owners of their own firm, and not make all the decisions themselves, but be engaged in their workplace. And I noticed that, I didn't know his name at the time, but Luis was sitting in the front row and he's twitching. All those of you who teach, I'm sure, have seen this. A student who just can't get his hand or her hand all the way up. And I was getting nervous because we basically made the decision. We were going forward. There was a good feeling in the room. And finally, Luis's hand went up. And, you know, being the democratic type, I felt I needed to call on him. So he stood, and rather than facing me, he turned around and looked at the rest of you. And he said, I want you to know who I am. My name is Luis, and my dignity is tied to what we're doing today. I have never owned anything in my life, but after today, I'm going to. And everybody in the room stood up for Luis. I walked off the stage. There was no reason for me to do anything else, because he had captured what it means to be engaged. He knew his dignity was tied to what he was trying to do. So as I leave you with the words of my mom, who told me probably 1,000 times as I was growing up and still reminds me today that I'm going to be judged by the people who I spend my time with. And the work you do is incredibly important. Engaged learning is a topic that can help change the world. Experiential learning is a very meaningful thing in schools, in institutions of higher education, and in the workplace. And so if I'm going to be judged by the people I spend my time with, I'm proud to be judged by being with you. So thank you very much.